Right, so I'm delighted to introduce Dr. Tim Cooper, who is going to speak tonight on the desire for the new, responsibility in a throwaway culture. And until very, very recently, Tim was Professor of Sustainable Design and Consumption at Nottingham Trent University. He was one of the founder members of Green Christian, or Christian Ecology Link, as we then were. And he was its first national coordinator and is a former chair of the organisation. And I'm pleased to say he's still a trustee. Over to Tim.
Well, thank you, Barbara. It's a pleasure to be able to present some of my research within the context of a Christian setting, which is unusual for me because most of my work is to fellow academics. And what I'm going to try and do is just give you a broad outline of the work I've been doing now for some 25 years. It will be quite fast, so forgive me for that. I've got 15 slides to go through, which I hope will be able to fit into 45 minutes, but I won't go into some levels of detail that you might like. I'm very happy to share slides, and obviously we'll have some time at the end of the presentation to discuss some of the issues in more detail. So, first slide, please. The context for my research is consumption. My first degree was in economics, and it was that led me down the path of exploring what we mean by sustainable economics. At the time, at university back in the 1970s, I was studying when the report, The Limits to Growth, came out. And one of the issues, or one of the dimensions to economics that was clearly significant, although not really put in a sustainability context at the time, was how much we're consuming. But a succession of reports have demonstrated that our consumption is excessive, it's unsustainable. So the OECD, which is the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, made up of the world's leading industrialized societies, so not a radical think tank or campaigners, says confronting the scale of these challenges requires more ambitious policies to increase resource productivity. In other words, when you look at what we're doing by way of consumption of materials, and you see on the left of the slide there, that what we're doing has doubled our consumption of materials consumed from the earth over the past 30 years, and that's liable to quadruple by 2050, that requires some dramatic action. There are a number of areas in which economists are looking, for example, the idea of decoupling, the extent to which we can grow our economies whilst not increasing our consumption of materials. I'll park that for the moment because that's a technical area which we can discuss at length later if you wish. I want instead to focus on the other key strategic approach the governments are using, which is that of the circular economy. And I'm mindful that you've had one or two talks on this already, but for those who weren't able to be there, the idea of the circular economy is that you preserve the value in products for as long as possible and retain those resources within the economy. That's a definition from the European Commission that in 2015 brought out a circular economy action plan. And despite its name, circular economy, it's not just about recycling. Recycling is commonly described as closing the loop, in other words, using resources again and again, and that is, of course, important. But a growing number of researchers and political analysts are recognizing that within the circular economy, it is important to slow the flow of materials as well as close the loop of materials. In other words, it's not just a question of ensuring that materials are recycled, but rather that once they've been used, the use to which they've been put is maintained. And here is the first allusion to product lifetimes. Next slide, please. You would have seen in the previous slide, the report Beyond Recycling. Beyond Recycling was essentially the first bit of work I did in this area. I was working at the New Economics Foundation in the early 1990s and was asked to do some work on integrating materials conservation and the economy. And it became apparent to me, even then, back in the 1990s, that there was a lot of work going on then about how to increase recycling, but not about increasing product lifetime. So that basically set me on my course, which I later followed through from research into academia. I was at Sheffield Hallam University for 15 years and then Nottingham Trent for a further 12 years. Recently retired, but I'm still a professor there and still do research with PhD students and a few other projects. Now, this talk isn't going to be rooted every slide and connected with so it's rooted in the Christian faith, but I'm not going to draw points and quote Bible verses every PowerPoint slide. But what I do want to do is to frame this from the outset is to note that our behavior as consumers and our behavior as Christians is inexplicably linked. And that is not rocket science or revolutionary for this audience, but if I went inside many churches, it will be very different. I was at a meeting of our eco-diocese working group in Sheffield a couple of days ago, and we were noting that in terms of living simply or changing our lifestyle, many churches have reached the stage of fair trade coffee, but haven't gone much beyond that. So there's a lot of work to be done, I think, in communicating how, as Christians, we have to behave differently. One of the most influential books I've ever read, The Travail of Nature by Paul Santmar, tried to explain why, from a Christian perspective, people end up believing different things, and I would infer from that, doing different things. It's possible to read the Bible differently. But I believe that we can read it in such a way that it demands, and should read it in such a way, demands a behaviour in what and how we consume. That then leads us to ask the question, well, if, as Santmar argues, we may or may not behave in a different way according to our beliefs, why might that be? And for that, it's important to look at research that's being done, in particular in what's known as consumer behaviour theory, which is rooted in social psychology. Why do we behave as we do behave? I've done a little bit, but not much work in this area. But I just want to touch on a couple of examples of why we need to behave differently in how we consume as Christians, because it's significant in trying to explain to other people why Christians aren't taking a lead in areas such as consumption. Many are, of course, I'm generalizing. And consumer behavior theory looks at our attitudes, our beliefs, our norms, and our values, and uses those to try and explain why we behave as we do. And from a Christian perspective, in each of those areas, there are reasons why we should behave differently, change our behavior. Whether it's in our attitudes, that as Christians we ought to assume responsibility for the planet before God, and therefore we can't be passive as we see the Earth's resources being used up. Whether it's beliefs about outcomes of what we consume, and Christians ought to be driven by the vision of the kingdom of God on earth. Thy will be done on earth as in heaven. And of course, as Christians, we have a particular role because, as the late Sir John Houghton, the leading climate change scientist, once said, the church is the largest NGO. In other words, we actually could have a big influence if only we realise that as a community. And lastly, recent research on behaviour change has highlighted the role of values, in particular work by Shalom Schwartz. And we had a member of Green Christians, she's still a member, Miriam Pepper, who did a PhD in this area and found that at present, using the model of how do values affect our change, found that Christians do tend to have slight differences in the way we consume compared to those who are not Christians, but it's quite minor, and we have to ask why. So that's a bit of context for where I'm coming from in time to integrate Christianity and our behaviour. But the focus of the talk tonight is about specific forms of consumer behaviour, and particularly how frequently we replace our products. And again, forgive me, I know I'm talking to many people who I live in a green lifestyle, but I'm trying to put this in a nationally global context to understand the issues. Next slide, please. Product lifetimes is an emerging debate. I've been doing work since the 1990s, and for often it felt like I was one of very few people interested in this area. But in recent years, particularly through the growth of interest in the circular economy, politicians, the campaigners, environmentalists, activists of all kinds are looking at how long stuff lasts. And in particular, we've seen growth over the past 7 years since the launch of the European Union's Circular Economy Action Plan, which not only recognised the need to increase recycling, but highlighted the potential to increase or extend product lifetimes, not least through legislation to require products to have a certain lifetime before they're marketed in the European Union. At the moment, there's a lot of research being done in Brussels and beyond, and when I say beyond, it's a major project at Delft University on planned obsolescence. There are plans for particular policies, such as labelling products according to their anticipated lifespan, that I find quite exciting. The British government has followed that up, and it brought out a waste and resources strategy in 2018. And it made quite a few of the right noises. And it's important to note that although we've left the European Union, we are going to have to abide by many of the policies of the European Union, because many of the manufacturers are, of course, positioning products, sort of marketing products into other European countries. So the UK market's too small for their strategies. So they have to pay attention to what's going on in Europe. So the government has made some of the right noises, and I know people in DEFRA very well, who themselves are very committed, whether that commitment and enthusiasm within DEFRA can extend to other, perhaps more influential parts of government, of course, has yet to be seen. Within academia, when I first became an academic, not many other people were working in this area. It's a handful of people in Switzerland and Japan and Germany, but not many. In 2015, I set up a conference called PLATE, Product Lifetimes in the Environment, and we started off with it's about 60 or so papers were presented at that, and now we have over 200. It's grown, held every 2 years, showing the growing interest for research into how long stuff lasts, because people are increasingly aware that we need to move away from our throwaway society. At Nottingham Trent University, in the 12 years that I was employed there, and I'm still attached, as I said, but while I was an employee, did a lot of work in a whole range of different areas, products such as clothing, electrical goods, vehicles, furniture and the like, lots of different dimensions, user repair, the quality of products, business models, government policy and the like. And I'll touch on some of those in the rest of this presentation. Next slide, please. In the early days of the research, one of the things we were looking at is how to design things that last longer. The term most of you will be familiar with, planned obsolescence, this concern that things could be designed to last longer, led us to explore why aren't things lasting as long as they used to, which is most people's perception. Whether that's true or not, I'll come to in a moment. And one is to do with the quality of materials, the plasticization of many of our consumer goods, which is a product or material rather, which tends not to last as long. It's easy to snap or break. It doesn't age well, unlike wood and metal. So the materials we look at, the way things are designed to fit together and the ability to separate them is crucial. Increasingly, products are made in a modular way, which is sometimes good, but often bad. So, for example, now it's impossible to repair a washing machine drum because the bearings are locked inside it, and what might have been a cheap repair becomes a job where you have to replace the whole drum, which usually costs about half the price of a new washing machine, even before you add on labour costs. So how products are designed has an impact on whether they're repairable or not. Another problem is components. If you have products, that component parts that aren't standardized, they tend to be more expensive, possibly less repairable. We have the impact of fashion and the trend towards making not just clothing fashionable, but everything fashionable. So that when you, not you, but when people have their kitchens repaired, they feel obliged to get a new set of kitchen toasters and kettles and like to match the new paint on the wallpaper and the like. And then there are issues increasingly, I mentioned modularity a moment ago, but in the context of upgradability, there are issues for particularly electronic goods of software, that it becomes out of date, and increasingly products cannot be, may still function, but not as effectively because the software has become outdated. Next slide, please. So, what is the appropriate lifespan of a consumer good? Well, obviously, that's a huge area and one can't generalize, but let me touch on the 2 or 3 areas. The first is that although I hinted a moment ago at the suggestion that products don't last as long as they did in the past, methodologically, it's very hard to prove that. There's been a little bit of work from a German and Dutch study and a Japanese study. They contradict each other. The Japanese study suggested there's been an increase in product lifetimes. The German and Dutch work suggests there's been a decline. It varied by product. There was some stronger evidence from the Japanese study that, for example, cars are lasting longer than they did 20 years ago. The German and Dutch data suggested that some kitchen appliances in particular, there was a decline. The problem is products change over time, so you're not always comparing exactly the same product. And products fail for different reasons. For example, there'll be some who'd say that driving an old diesel car is not great from a sustainability perspective. Others would say, well, if you look at the embodied energy in that car, in other words, the energy used to make to refine the metals and to make the product, you ought to keep it until it doesn't work anymore. Some work's been done by academics using a technique called life cycle analysis. This does suggest indeed that longer lastings are environmentally preferable. Others, some will contest that. I say that the others are probably, in most cases, wrong, and it'd be a real exception for a short-lived product to be better for the environment than the long-lasting product. One last point here is the need to recognise a distinction between the terms longevity and durability. Durability relating to how the product has been designed and made. Longevity embraces the user dimension. In other words, it's how long the product actually lasts in practice. So its longevity might not be as long as its durability because products are thrown away prematurely. And research by groups like RAP have shown a significant portion of products, particularly furniture, but also appliances and clothes, and particularly clothes, a high proportion of those are still functional. So, and there are second-hand markets, but that is to miss the point, which is that many of the products aren't owned and so aren't kept by consumers for as long as they could be. Next slide, please. So there's some tensions here in the discussion on product lifetimes. One being about, as I hinted a moment ago, energy efficiency of new products, and does it justify replacing older products? Possible tensions between durability and recyclability. You might have a product which is a composite metal, or indeed a polycotton shirt, which is more likely to last longer than a single fibre or single metal product, but it's not recyclable at end of life. So there are environmental issues to worry about there. And then there are issues about who's responsible. Is it consumers? Is it producers? Is it government? And I'm going to spend most of the rest of the time of this presentation looking at exactly that. Next slide, please. Before I look at responsibility, I'm just going to touch on 3 areas. I think it's important that we actually ground the discussion, not in the abstract, but in particular products. And we've done a fair bit of work at Nottingham Trent on the 3 that I'll go through now, starting with household appliances. So household appliances are regulated throughout Europe and still in the UK through a waste directive called WEEE, the Waste Electrical and Electronic Equipment Directive. which came into force, gosh, nearly 20 years ago now, which was hoped originally would promote better design products, longer lasting products, as well as more recyclable products. But because of the way that the directive was framed and interpreted and applied, it has been something of a failure. It hasn't really influenced, apart from the margins in some of the poorer performing European countries, it hasn't done much to actually change the universe. That said, it is an important piece of legislation that is continually being revived and revised, I should say, and revived. So there's that legislation. There's another piece of legislation called the Eco Design Directive, which previously has focused on appliances, but is being broadened out to cover other areas. Crucially, it has within it the capacity for the European Commission to regulate minimum lifetimes of products. We've already begun to see that with some components. So, for example, vacuum cleaner motors now have to last at least 500 hours, implying 10 years. And that's just a very small example of something that could become quite significant in future years. And indeed, the updated Circular Economy Action Plan, which came out in 2020, has suggested quite strongly that the Eco Design Directive can be used to kick off some of the worst performing products off the market, to prevent producers from putting into the European market cheap, short-lived goods. Whether they'll have the guts to do that, time alone will tell. The third point there is about planned obsolescence, and this is increasingly an area for discussion. Not only is there the research study that I mentioned a moment ago at Delft University, the French government have actually banned planned obsolescence about 4 or 5 years ago, I believe now it was. So now a French manufacturer found to be deliberately curtailing the lifespan of certain products can be taken to court. And indeed, there has been some work in using different regulation. Italian legislation was used to actually penalise Samsung and Apple for planned obsolescence. So things are happening here, which are quite encouraging. Another newer area of growth is this interest in repair and the so-called right to repair. And this has been prompted in particular by a growing understanding of the potential for users to repair products, but also a growing problem faced by independent repairers who are prevented from access to manuals and therefore can't do the repairs themselves because the manufacturers want to do it themselves and capitalise on extra income. So there's a big discussion going on in Europe about right to repair. And we've seen some changes in recent years that hopefully are going to promote the repair sector. There's expectations, the fact that people's expectations have fallen, more about that recently. And I've touched on repairability and durability labelling already, but I'll just mention here again the good old French. The French have already introduced a repairability label for certain products. They did that a couple of years ago, and you'll see an example of that with the 3.5 to 9.5 in the little image at the bottom there. Next slide, please. So furniture is another area of concern, not least because we've seen the emergence of what's been dubbed fast furniture. Some of you will be familiar with the term fast fashion to highlight the way in which fashion actually means that people are often changing their clothes and buying and selling extremely quickly these days, causing huge problems. Over 1 million tons of clothing thrown away each year. We've seen the decline of antiques, of a love for the old products. And I indeed have a practical example of trying to sell some products that were in my parents' home when they died about 20 years ago. And we had it in our own house for about 10, 15 years. And there came a point when I wanted to change what we had. And the actual value of those antique goods have virtually been cut by 3/4 compared to 10 or so years previously. So far from antiques increasing in value over time, they've declined in value over time. Even good quality mahogany antiques have been declining in value as people's expectations move towards things like IKEA. Now, IKEA is a fascinating company. There are some very bad aspects to what they do, and we'll all be familiar with going into IKEA shops and seeing some fairly shoddy goods there. At the same time, at the top of IKEA, some of the thinkers there have made some of the right noises, and they talked about peak stuff. They've recognised that we can't carry on the way we are in terms of consuming more and more things. And strategically, they've been moving in the right direction, albeit rather slowly than perhaps some of their marketing people have tried to make out. There are big issues raised by IKEA that are a good exemplar of products more generally, which is to do with prices and quality. It's all well and good saying that products ought to last longer, but that's okay for people who have high incomes. What about the poor? And of course, IKEA took off because they really were able to do reasonably good value, relatively cheap products for people who are moving into new houses. And I'm an example of that. When we first got married, we did buy quite a lot of IKEA stuff because it was competitively priced. And indeed, to my right, I have some cabinets there that I bought, and they are 30-odd years old, and they are in perfectly good condition. But for many products, there is a trade-off between price and quality. That's a difficult case to argue in an unjust society where many people would like to own better quality things but can't afford them. I also want to touch here briefly about repair and maintenance skills, because one of the reasons why much furniture is thrown away is because it hasn't been well looked after in terms of polishing, and people don't know how to get rid of stains on furniture often. I can say more about that later. Let's move on. I realise time is relatively limited, so let me move on to clothing. Clothing is an area where, in my 12 years at Nottingham Trent, I had the most interest from industry, which might sound a bit strange because, as I've said earlier, the industry is riddled with fast fashion, the growth of companies like Zara and Primark and Boohoo, and most recently the Chinese company Shine, basically designing products that are frequently short-lived and often not recyclable or recycled. And indeed, if you go and see recycled products on an item of clothing, the chances are it hasn't been recycled from clothing. It's been recycled almost certainly from plastic bottles, because the feedstock, the material, is consistent with the bottle, whereas with clothing, there are different colours, different types of plastic, and so on. So the real problem with fast fashion, much of which is made from synthetic materials, it's not cotton or wool, it's something like polyester and the like, and many of those products are also are not recyclable because they've got mixed fibres in them, and in some cases a range of components in them, so they have things that are hard to actually prepare for recycling, like attached buttons and things that make the recycling task more expensive than it would be otherwise. So the fast fashion model is intrinsically problematic. That said, there are people in the industry that are recognising this, and there's an organisation called WRAP, who've been working on this for around 15 years on something called the Sustainable Clothing Action Plan. They emerged in the Tony Blair, David Cameron era, and they're an organisation that focuses on voluntary agreements. So they work with industry to look at what to do to try and improve the sustainability in the sector. The areas where they've probably been most effective is exploring areas such as how to design products for longevity, how to enable consumers or educate consumers to keep things for longer, to wash them in a way that will mean they're more likely to last longer, because laundering has a big impact on product lifetimes. What they haven't done, and not least because of their work close to industry, is reduce consumption, because that's a real problem for industry. And there are people in industry who I've spoken to who know that the key thing for the clothing industry is to maintain profitability but reduce volumes. That's what they want to do. They know there's a problem in what they're doing. It's how to do it. We'll come to business models in a few minutes' time. Of course, many people buy lots of clothes and give them to charity stores, and they think they're doing a good thing. Now, they're doing a better thing than chucking it into a landfill, or having it chucked into a landfill site, or even recycled. But we have a big problem. That the number of people who want to buy second-hand clothes, though growing, particularly amongst the young, is far less than the number of garments that are put into the second-hand market and into clothing shops. The majority of things, the majority of garments that charity shops get are shipped overseas. They can't be sold in the UK. And often when they're shipped overseas, the countries there have a clothing industry which is threatened because people see these cheap overseas British goods, and that means they maybe stop buying products made locally. So there's a justice issue there going on. Lastly, on clothing, one has to say there are signs of progress here. A few years ago, no retailer would consider selling second-hand goods if they have new goods in their shops. Now we have a number of high street retailers, H&M, Topshop to name but two, who are quite happy to buy back products and sell them again as second-hand goods, recognising there's profit may be made there. And this lastly on clothing lifestyle, it's a complex area because people often don't get rid of their clothes when they should. They store them. And that's a problem because when they put them back in the market, they're out of fashion. There are big issues also to do with the fact that bodies change over time and people lack the skills to alter clothes in the way perhaps they ought to. And often clothing isn't actually designed to be altered anymore. The seams are too thin. Next slide, please. So the last section of the presentation, look at responsibility. And I'm going to take it in three parts: the responsibility of industry, the responsibility of consumers, and the responsibility of government. Let's start off with industry. Most of you will have heard of the term planned obsolescence, but many of you will not be familiar with its origins. Its origins go back to the 1930s. The first use of the term planned obsolescence came in a pamphlet in the 1930s during the Great Recession there. And it was written by a guy called Bernard London, who proposed that given the massive unemployment at the time, the government should impose maximum product lifetimes, after which people would be required to return used goods to government agencies to be disposed of, so that they would then have to buy a new product, and that would hopefully kickstart the economy. The idea didn't really take off, but it was being proposed there. And what's significant about this is that that kind of idea periodically resurfaces. So through the 1980s and 90s and 2000s, there have been occasions where the government has proposed scrappage schemes whereby if you bring in your old appliance or an old vehicle, an old boiler, you would then get a government subsidy to promote the purchase of a new one. And that has happened for cars in the not too distant past. Don't know whether it's happened for boilers yet, but there's certainly been talk about it because the government wants people to throw things away to kickstart the car industry or the appliance industry. So it's an issue that's lasted. The term planned obsolescence really became popular from the 1950s through used by a marketing executive called Brooks Stevens, where he talked about marketing to instill in the buyer the desire to own something a little newer, a little better, a little sooner than is necessary. And this is a widely used quote to describe what is meant by planned obsolescence. In other words, the idea that not only should products be designed in such a way that they fail, but rather beyond that, consumers should be used to throw away products before they failed. Roll on 50 years, and we're now seeing a bit of a fight back. And I say fight back with a bit of sadness, because the environmental movement with which I've been associated for 50 years, I've been a member of Friends of the Earth since the late 1970s, haven't really taken obsolescence as serious as it ought to have done. But now they're being forced to. But the real drive has not been in Britain at all, but as I mentioned a moment ago, it's been in France. So in France, you have a campaign called Halt l'Obsolescence. In other words, Stop Planned Obsolescence. Thousands of members campaigning for longer lasting products. And it's no surprise that that is on the back of a campaign to increase repairability, and they've got the first legislation there, complemented with this planned obsolescence legislation that will fine companies that are seen to carry on legitimising obsolescence, saying that it's okay. No cases have been brought yet, but it's an important signal that that is the mindset amongst politicians now, that planned obsolescence is no longer acceptable. Next slide, please. What are the implications for business? Well, the first implication is that businesses need to reassess their business model, because for many of them, the business model is predicated on increasing volumes year by year as companies, and as far as possible, increasing volumes year by year as a sector in the economy as a whole. And that can't happen. We know that from an environmental perspective, but it's now becoming more apparent to those companies through the Circular Economy Initiative. So they're having to look at how to maintain their profits and increase the financial value of their products while reducing physical volume, the throughput of goods that they're responsible for. It means, for example, some of them are exploring whether they can offer a repair service, an after-sales service, for example. Interesting, there are companies that have set a lead for many years here. So Patagonia spring to mind. They had a really provocative advert out, probably 5 years ago now, which you'll see at the bottom right there. Don't buy this jacket. Not many companies actually invite the readers not to buy their products, but it's all part of an initiative to say, we design our products to last, and they offer a repair service on their products. The issue for both Patagonia and others is cost. Patagonia products are relatively expensive. We'll come to the problem for consumers, but in a moment. But from a business perspective, one of the issues that they're looking at is how to sell durability, and the best way to do that is to align it not necessarily with sustainability, because many consumers aren't motivated by sustainability, but rather by quality, by saying that if you buy our products, it's worth paying the extra. The problem there, though, is that researchers have demonstrated there's a fair degree of non-alignment between price and quality. In other words, people don't know when they're paying more, if they are getting more intrinsic value in terms of quality, or just paying for a brand name. I've touched on the idea for business of selling more services alongside sales. I'm always baffled by the fact that, for example, shoe shops don't offer a repair in-house. So why is it that Clarks don't have a Timpson's within the shop to say, buy a Clarks shoe and then get it repaired once it needs resold? I just don't understand why that hasn't happened. And now I've touched on the other implication there, which is that a product puts a product on the market, but historically they've done that once. So this idea of buyback and resell is that they, at the end of the point at which the first buyer doesn't want it anymore, the company buys it back and then resells it and makes money that way. So there's some interesting areas where businesses are looking at exploring in the context of this discussion. Next slide, please. We turn to the consumers. Consumption is the problem. You'll hear the government say in the context of climate change that it's great how we're reducing our emissions, but of course the emissions are based on production, not on consumption. So if we carry on consuming, but the goods that we're consuming are made in China or Thailand or India or Pakistan or even other parts of Europe, that doesn't count as part of our emissions. You'll see, not very clearly, but you'll see in the top right chart there, the difference between consumption-based emissions and production-based emissions. Consumption-based is the one at the top, and will you be able to read it clearly on a big screen? You'll see that consumption-based emissions is pretty similar now to where it was in 2016. It hasn't really reduced very much at all. That's the bluey kind of thing. It went up and then went down again during one of the recessions. Production emissions have gone down a little bit more steadily, as you'll see there. So we need to address consumption. So why do we consume so much so quickly? Well, sociologist Colin Campbell, writing in the early 1990s, wrote a fascinating chapter in a book called The Desire for the New, where he tried to explore why people want new things all the time. And he encapsulated that in a threefold description of new being novel or different, new being technically improved, and new being pristine. Each has to be addressed and each has a response in terms of the kinds of people who want different things. And again, during the conversations to follow, I'd be interested to take that up. But essentially, the first one will relate to fashion. We want fashion that's the latest and the newest. The second relates to the facilities of products and issues to do with the functions of products and the issues to do with improvements over time, particularly with consumer electronics, for example, but increasingly the use of electronics in a whole range of different other products. And then pristine, our ability or otherwise to maintain products in a pristine condition. The work that's been done over recent years has shown that consumers are not good at maintaining products. We've done some work in that regard on vacuum cleaners. The report at the bottom right there found that many people don't really know how to maintain vacuum cleaners. They only clear the brush head when it gets clogged up with human hair, for example, leading to the motors burning out. They're not inclined to repair for whatever reason, because of the cost, because it's inconvenient, because they can't do it themselves, whatever reason, and they throw away things prematurely. So research by Harold Weiser in Austria found that people say they want products to last a long period of time, but they tend only to want to keep it themselves for around half that period. In other words, pass it on to the poor. That's not a way which is going to be sustainable and just for the future. Next slide, please. What can we do? Well, we need to raise people's expectations. So when I do my presentation to academics, I'm often pointing out an anecdote from my own household, where my parents both died in 1997, and they bought their fridge in 1958, and it was the same one that I was having to get rid of. So it lasted 38 years, their fridge. How many fridges made today will last 38? There may be some listening today who have got fridges that old. I usually get one or two per audience come up with that, but most don't. But the key point is the expectations have fallen for many, many products. I've seen numerous figures that suggest that often for appliances, the expectation is less than 10 years for products that clearly could be made to last much longer. There are exceptions, for example. So a Miele washing machine is designed to last for 20 years, but the vast majority are more likely to last closer to 10. We need to raise expectations to get people to demand them to last longer and to be willing to pay more. We've done some research that actually, rather disturbingly, found that consumers are broadly satisfied with product lifetimes. If you look at the chart top right there, the olive green and turquoise green show people, the proportion of people satisfied with product lifetimes. In other words, for most products, 80% said they're satisfied with the lifetime of products categorized there. However, one of the problems is we're not well informed. We don't know how long things have been designed to last for, hence the significance of lifespan labeling. We don't have easy opportunities to repair things. They're not accessible. Trying to find a good repairer is often quite hard. People don't feel they have the repair skills themselves, particularly for things like even repairing items of clothing, which in the days of home economics courses, people learned at school, but do no longer. People are no longer certain about value for money. We don't know whether you can trust brands or not. But also, there's some issues about what's called emotional durability. How can we get people to want things to for longer, to have that kind of sense of attachment to products and to overcome this problem of products being thrown away prematurely? So lastly, and I'm coming to an end now, what about government? Next slide, please. Governments need to act. If we're going to overcome these problems, governments need to act. We need governments that are going to make businesses accountable for materials consumption. And that means what's been known as extended producer responsibility, going beyond just a technical responsibility for products for the first couple of years of their life. Product has to be of satisfactory quality and has to be fit for purpose and to function as described as the basic points of law at the moment. We need to go beyond that. The idea of extended producer responsibility is the product lasts for a particular period of time, and then the manufacturer is responsible not only for how long it's lasted, but also for what happens at end of life. particularly if it ends up destined for a landfill site. We need laws strengthened in that area, and they are in process in the European Union beyond vehicles and appliances where they already apply. We need far better processes for waste collection to promote reuse, repair, upcycling, and the like. We need improved product quality standards. We need government to utilise legislation such as the Eco-Design Directive to take off the market products not designed to last. I don't believe any small appliance that is not designed to last for 5 years should be allowed on the market. And linked to that is the idea of guarantees. And again, growing amount of work being done in Europe now on using guarantees as a way of upping the game. You can have a product standard, that's one approach, but if you have a required guarantee, whether you have a standard or not doesn't matter. The company has to maintain that product for the length of that guarantee. So we're seeing suggestions that guarantees can be used on products to essentially change the product to a service. So you buy a product, shall we say a refrigerator, it's got a 15-year guarantee, and if it goes wrong, the manufacturer has to replace the guarantee or repair it for that period. It changes the product into a service of cooling products rather than a lump of metal that it sells you to start off with and then doesn't care what happens to it after a couple of years, which historically has been the way companies have behaved. Crucially, and I put my economics hat back on here, we need green fiscal reform, in other words, taxing resource use rather than labour, taxing energy and materials and getting rid of all employers' national insurance contributions, which would immediately have an effect on the repair replacement equation. It will make repair relatively favourable over replacement, whereas the reverse is true at the moment. So much could be done if the economy was reshaped in the interest of sustainability. And we need the government to intervene to promote consumers' interest. They've done it in France. They've banned planned obsolescence. They're looking at extending right to repair legislation. Some legislation has already been introduced across Europe to make manuals more easily accessible to repairers. We need labelling to ensure that consumers who want to do the right thing, who've had their expectations increased, can then go to a shop with the knowledge of how long a product has been designed to last. So I hope that's been an interesting overview of this area of work. It's a dynamic area, it's an area that's growing in policy circles and academic circles. To summarise, product longevity is central to the circular economy debate. That's becoming increasingly recognised amongst those politicians, academics and campaigners. We need to understand the influences upon our behaviour as Christians. I'd love to see more work being done in this area. Miriam Pepper's work is probably 10 years old now, and I haven't seen much that's followed it up. But as Christians, we need to understand why our behaviour doesn't differ significantly from that of people who don't hold the beliefs that we hold. Responsibility is shared, and I've tried to show in the presentation, industry, consumers and government all have a role to play. But ending on a note of hope that we do see growing interest across Europe in increased product lifetimes. Thank you for that, and I'm very, very happy indeed to answer any questions.
Thank you, Tim, and I think you've given us a huge amount to think about from your academic experience and your engagement with industry and government. And I'm really, really grateful for your being with us this evening. There are several questions coming up, and these people on the call do feel free to add other questions to the chat, and I'll try and keep abreast of them. There's a question from Rod, Tim. What do you think about the idea of taxing companies to pay for the disposal of their product and packaging, etc., with exemptions for recyclable items, penalties for landfill and so forth? Is that a possible way of tackling some of the issues?
Yeah, it's how to make that logistically possible has been the issue here. So the best example of this is with household appliances, where the WEEE directive did anticipate early on that manufacturers would pay the cost for the disposal of used appliances. What happened was that in the discussion that was taking place in the late 1990s, there was a tension between those who wanted what's called individual producer responsibility and those who wanted collective producer responsibility, and the latter won. So what happened was that rather than, for example, Sony or Indesit or Candy or whoever collecting those products at end of life and then paying the cost of disposal, the implication being that because disposal is expensive because of landfill tax, they would then have a financial incentive to design their products to last longer and be recyclable. What happened instead was that the industry as a whole became responsible for disposable of appliances as a whole. So the system as it currently works is such that companies do pay, but only for at an industry level through various levies. So it doesn't really work. Now, there is a process with the rather obscure name of modulated fees, which is doing the rounds at the moment, and I'm not particularly up to speed on where they are. But the idea of a modulated fee is that the company will pay the fee according to its market share, which and the idea of that is that essentially it'll do what you're suggesting. It won't be a tax on the company, it'll be a levy on products put on the market. So if they put on the market, should we say 1.5 million appliances, should we say 200,000 have to be landfilled because they're not recyclable, the cost of that would be chargeable to the company. So it is possible. The Circular Economy Action Plan 2020, the updated version, is looking at applying that principle of extended producer responsibility to both textiles and furniture as well as appliances. So there is work going on in this area, which, as I said earlier, is quite encouraging.
Right, thank you. And Catherine says, Tim, you mentioned manufacturers and remanufacturing. Is there room for tallying good warranties with this? I was just writing this as you talked about guarantees, and I was thinking that people might trust remanufacturing more if they're accompanied by strong guarantees.
Yes, I mean, remanufacturing from an academic perspective is quite narrowly framed. It's pretty much taking products completely apart, putting them together again and cleaning them and making them as new. Slightly different from refurbishment or repair, which are sort of lighter touch. But in the case with all of them, most remanufacturing is for large-scale engineering products at the moment because it's just not economic to remanufacture a small-sized product. But to take the wider point of guarantees, yes, I think one of the problems with encouraging people to buy second-hand goods is they don't come with a warranty. With an item of clothing, you look at it and you can see the touch and feel and pretty much tell whether the second-hand garment is going to last. You can't do that with a fridge or a radio or whatever. Most guarantees in the second-hand market are no more than 3 months. So to actually encourage that sector of the market, I do think longer guarantees would work. I'm always confused by the way in which companies who actually are quite good don't utilise guarantees as a way to signal quality. And the example that immediately springs to my mind is when I was buying my daughter a watch. I'm going back about 10, 15 years now, but we went to a retail, I can't remember which one it was now, and there were 2 watches, and one was a flashy watch for over £100, another was a cheap watch for about £20, £25. And they both had a 1-year warranty. And I thought to myself, well, I like the one that's £100 plus. I might think it's slightly aesthetically more satisfying. But is it better? Will it not last any longer than the first one? What's its inside like? And I don't understand why that company that had gone to extra effort to make it aesthetically pleasing didn't actually say, well, ours is also functionally better. You get a 2-year warranty or a 5-year warranty or a 10-year warranty. Because if they had, I might have bought that product and spent the extra, but they didn't. As I said earlier, there have been studies done recently on warranties, but as yet we're not seeing much change. Where we did see change is on televisions. I remember back in the 1990s meeting the environmental manager of Panasonic, and he said, we offer a 1-year warranty. I said, why don't you offer more? He said, well, that's the industry norm. I said, but you're better than the industry norm. You're Panasonic. And he said, well, that's the way it is. It'll never happen. Well, of course, 10 years on, you go to a TV, buy a TV now, and they've nearly all got 5-10-year warranties on them because they've realised they're very reliable products. And if you don't offer 5 years, people will wonder, why? Because there are competitors that do. So it can be used for leverage, but it's not being used as effectively as it should be, in my view.
Right. And Anthony says, seems to me that suppliers have done very little to make foodstuff packaging recyclable or compostable. If they had to pay, would it not make them more likely to change their packaging quicker? Comment on that. Yeah.
From an academic perspective, I don't do packaging. It's a huge area in its own right. And as academics, we have to limit our areas. I already straddle several product sectors and have difficulty keeping up with legislation and initiatives in those areas. So my knowledge of packaging is less. But that said, there has been moves in this area, but nowhere near fast enough. So if you look at packaging, in fact, only yesterday I got some fruit and veg, and it had packaging which was plastic, and they said this is compostable. Now, as someone who's done had compost heaps for 20 years, I can tell you that some of the packaging I put in there will probably last for 20 years, despite being labelled as compostable. And I think there was a BBC programme a year or two ago which asked about people's experience of so-called compostable packaging. They're not there yet. I tend to find personally that when I put something plastic, which I use for my compost bin, in the compost heap, it usually takes 2 cycles of composting. So whereas normally my compost might break down after 6 to 9 months, for the plastic element, it's usually a year and a half or so. How you address this? Well, there is something called the Packaging Directive. I'm not an expert in that area. And I think my understanding is that the Packaging Directive, certainly the first configuration of that, was only secondary packaging. I mean, it's easy for us as consumers to think that we're responsible for the flow of materials. But if you look at the amount of packaging that's all the way along the supply chain, and indeed in agriculture, vast amounts of packaging being used to wrap up wheat and stuff like that, and hay and stuff like that. It's important it's important for packaging to be addressed at that level. At the level of the retail shop, it's still important. You go to shops, like Waitrose, and they're making slow moves in the right direction, but sometimes it's 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I do see examples of things that are not as good as things I've seen previously. So I can't, give a real answer to that because I'm not an expert on the law in that area. Of course, there are issues of single-use packaging. Most of us will be familiar with Nutella and how they used to serve Nutella up in jar glass. You could just use as glasses afterwards. It grieves me to have to throw away glass jars of any kind into the glass recycling unit, knowing that it's going to break up and be reconstituted at great cost in terms of energy into exactly the same item again. You'll all be familiar, obviously, with the days of deposits and bringing back bottles. And again, I see no reason why we can't do that. It happens in other parts of Europe.
There's a couple of there's 3 other questions at least here. So we'll just tackle a few of them with the aim of finishing by 8:12. Barbara says, you mentioned about that it might be better to keep an old diesel car on the road because of the embedded energy rather than buying a new, less polluting car. Are there exceptions to this on the grounds of the new using less energy and therefore less carbon?
I think the problem here, it's the extreme that might work. So you might have a 25-year-old, very efficient, very large old car, and you might decide you're going to replace it with a very small electric car. And you know that the old car will definitely be recycled, and a new car will be recyclable. Yeah, if you bring together that extreme, you might actually have an environmental case. The trouble is when governments bring schemes that are much more general than that aren't focused on sustainability benefits, but are more about reviving the car industry or whatever.
Right. And there's a question here about, could you say something about branding? This is from Rosie. I'm intrigued by the secret world that brands inhabit.
Yes, I have a PhD student doing work on branding and how to understand brands, because it's not always easy, and they often don't make it easy for themselves, not least because many companies own different brands, and even I can't keep up to speed with takeovers of companies, and you find that you're buying one brand, but in fact it's owned by a company from another brand, and they've got different reputations. But some of you will know there's Bosch Siemens, they're the same company. Are Siemens better than Bosch? Well, some people say they are, but some people say the real problem is some Bosch products are made overseas, and if they're made in Germany, they're okay. It does become very, very confusing to make head or tail of it, which is why labelling is so important. If you label a product according to its functionality, its longevity, you can go on that and not worry about whether it's got the right brand name or not.
Yeah. There's a comment from Tony that during the Second World War, products had to be designed to last because of material shortages. Could this legislation be revived and adapted to the current context?
Exactly, and that's what the Eco Design Directive allows. So the Eco Design Directive can prevent short-lived products being put onto the market in the European Union, and it's just a matter of time before we actually see some examples of that. One of the issues that will come up, I believe, is that it's often easier to, well, the manufacturers would say, you can design component parts to last. It's hard to talk about the whole product. I don't know whether I believe that, but certainly that happened with vacuum cleaners. They didn't say that vacuum cleaners have to last 10 years. They said that the motor has to last it, because that's the part that fails. The problem that usually the manufacturers use against this is that they don't want to be made liable for the lifetime of a product when that lifetime is affected by how it's used. So, for example, you might design a vacuum cleaner to last for 10 years. If it's never cleaned properly, so the motor burns out, you might have had a motor that's designed to last for 20 years, but it's been misused. Similarly with garments, it's quite hard to label garments according to a lifetime, because if you wash that garment every 2 days, it's not going to last as long, sorry, every 2 or 3 uses, it's not going to last as long as if you only wash it every 6 or 7 uses, for example, because laundry has a major impact on the lifetime of garments.
Great. Okay, there's a comment from Stella here. I might need you to kind of just put a gloss on this, Stella, so be prepared to unmute. You've said, is there innovation good policy or practice examples of the second-hand market? You appreciate it's all, or it is already there of sort, actively sustainable as well as circular economy, electronics in particular. Is that clear, Tim, or do you want Stella just to maybe put in a brief comment about the question?
Let me answer, and then Stella come back if my answer doesn't meet what she's looking for. So in terms of second-hand markets, I mean, there are examples in electronics of good second-hand companies like CEX, for example, and there have been long been companies because of the problem of technological obsolescence, but also people's desire to own the latest and the newest. Companies have emerged to mop up that market where the products do have some residual value. If you want to buy a second-hand electronic goods, you can do that. The CEX model is, I think, quite an interesting one because they have particular percentages they work to. So you can even use it yourself to buy products from and sell to and buy that. And so you lose a little bit each time, of course, but it means that you can change the product if you want to. So there are, I think, some interesting second-hand markets there. I think the problematic markets are more the informal markets, some of the high street second-hand appliance markets where, for they've been just lifted off the skip somewhere and you just don't know where it's going to last. You go to civic amenity sites and things left out in the rain. You think, well, it's the electrical product. You don't really want your electrical products to be left out in the rain before you buy them and so on. Does that answer your question, or do you want to amplify?
Yeah, the only other thing you mentioned in the fashion side that there was some sort of policy practice downsides of the recycling of fashion. Are there any things we should be driving the second-hand market towards? You've illustrated that beautifully with electronics, but I'm interested more generally.
Well, I think the second-hand market for clothing, I think they're doing as much as they can. I mean, if you look into most second-hand clothing retailers now, they're extremely effective. There was a time 20 years ago, they just dumped things on the shelf and poor people, old people normally would go and buy them, but that wasn't going to work. So now, the products are marketed in a very effective way, rebranded as vintage or pre-loved. As a consequence, they've gained the confidence of a much wider segment of the population who are buying second-hand garments now, and it no longer has the stigma that it's used to. The problem, though, isn't with that sector at all. The problem is the people who buy the products in the first place, because you're never going to have so many people, wanting to buy used goods as are available if people only wear things a couple of times and then throw them away. And there's research that's been done by Bananos, who said that the average fast fashion good is used between 6 to 8 times. That's not sustainable.
Okay, we've got time for one more question from Catherine, and then I just want to pose a final question, Tim. So Catherine's question: is legislation addressing the issue of electronic items that have hazardous toxins in their infrastructure, and when put on tips, there are environmental risks from leakage, even when collected by people living in poverty who look to derive an income from them? So is there legislation planned or out there that addresses this issue of hazardous toxins within electronic items?
Well, there is, but it's ineffective. So we know from researchers who've gone out to China that a lot of used appliances end up out there being taken apart for some kind of crude recycling in a very dangerous way. So certainly the export of used goods, I mean, technically we're allowed to export goods that have value for use, but we're not supposed to be exporting garments and appliances that are essentially waste. There are laws that cover that, but they're not well monitored. And anyone who's familiar with trading standards will be familiar with horror stories of companies that are found to have got away with it by packing lorries with a few good products at the front and having lots of waste at the back, and that ends up on a container to China, for example, and that's where the bad stuff happens. I mean, we need to localize a lot more. Most appliance recycling doesn't happen in Britain at all. It happens in a massive company in Belgium. Vast amounts of stuff that is in our lorries. When you go on motorways, you might think there are lots of products going around. Huge amounts of waste is going around, being shipped around the country and to other countries in lorries these days. I can't remember the percentage. It's something like 20% of lorries are transporting waste.
That's a very startling statistic, Tim. Final question from me. All of us are in one way or another involved with churches or other Christian communities, what are things that those communities should be prioritising in their own life and practice and witness, given all that you've talked about?
Well, I touched on this earlier because it came up at this meeting I was at, that I think most churches still, the only sort of sign of a difference in their consumption is the fair trade coffee after the service on a Sunday morning. So I think it's trying to get an understanding that as a church community, or as church communities, it's the whole of our consumption that matters. I mean, obviously, through Join Enough and through Plenty, we're trying to do our bit, aren't we, in communicating that to the masses. But it is slow progress at the moment. I mean, there are areas. So in the Church of England, which I'm a part, we are looking at net zero and the understanding of net zero. I was looking at the London Diocese have got a tool now for measuring progress towards net zero, and it did include people's consumption within that. So I think through that process of trying to reduce our carbon emissions, if we can get people to realise that it's not just about flying and using your car and heating the house, it's also about stuff, because stuff has embodied carbon in it, we might have a bit of leverage, apart from the quality of life issue, which of course we're all familiar that in theory we believe that you don't get happy by being rich, but don't know whether that really seems to make a difference in a lot of people's lives.
Well, thank you, Tim, very, very much for giving us your time and all the benefits of your expertise and experience and knowledge today. So we're very grateful to you, Tim, for the talk. For everyone else, I should also mention that we're hoping Tim will be leading a workshop on this issue. And in fact, I think Barbara has just put a note about it on the at our conference on the 8th of October. So you'll be able to talk to Tim more about this issue there. But thank you very, very much, Tim. Thank you, everyone else, for coming along. And I think it's 8:15, so we'll call the meeting to a close. Thanks again.